In the spring of 1929, as the Soviet Union accelerated its industrialization and collectivization campaigns under Joseph Stalin, a young botanist named Nikolai Vavilov stood before an international congress of geneticists in Berlin and delivered a presentation that would cement his reputation as one of the world's leading experts on plant genetics and evolution. Vavilov had spent years traveling across 5 continents, collecting over 200,000 seed samples, mapping the geographic origins of cultivated plants, and building what would become the world's largest collection of plant genetic material. His work represented the cutting edge of biological science, grounded firmly in Mendelian genetics and Darwinian evolution. But within a decade, this same man would find himself imprisoned, starving, and condemned by the very state he had devoted his career to serving. His downfall and the systematic destruction of Soviet genetics that accompanied it represents one of the most devastating episodes in the history of science, a cautionary tale about what happens when ideology is permitted to override empirical reality. The story begins not with Vavilov, but with the peculiar intellectual climate of the early Soviet state. The Bolsheviks, who seized power in 1917, were committed to a materialist worldview derived from Marxist philosophy, which rejected religious and mystical explanations for natural phenomena. In theory, this should have made them natural allies of modern science, particularly evolutionary biology, which explained the diversity of life through natural processes without recourse to divine intervention. Indeed, many early Soviet scientists were enthusiastic supporters of the revolution, seeing in it an opportunity to advance scientific education and research free from the constraints of Tsarist obscurantism. Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection was widely taught in Soviet schools and universities throughout the 1920s. Genetics, the science of heredity pioneered by Gregor Mendel and developed by scientists like Thomas Hunt Morgan, was also embraced by Soviet researchers who established world-class laboratories and made significant contributions to the field. But beneath this apparent harmony between Marxism and modern biology lay a fundamental tension. Classical genetics, as it was understood in the early 20th century, proposed that hereditary information was carried in discrete units called genes, which were passed from parents to offspring according to predictable mathematical ratios. Importantly, these genes were understood to be stable across generations, changing only through random mutations. This meant that the characteristics an organism acquired during its lifetime through interaction with its environment could not be passed on to its offspring. A blacksmith's muscular arms, developed through years of labor, would not be inherited by his children. This principle, established through countless experiments, contradicted an older theory of heredity associated with the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who had proposed in the early 19th century that acquired characteristics could indeed be inherited. For most scientists, the question had been settled by the early 20th century. Mendelian genetics, supported by overwhelming experimental evidence, had superseded Lamarckian inheritance. But for certain Soviet ideologists, this conclusion was deeply troubling. If heredity was fixed and could not be altered by environmental conditions, what did this mean for the Soviet project of creating a new socialist man? If human nature was determined by genes that changed only through random mutation over vast spans of time, could Soviet society truly transform its citizens, or were they forever constrained by their biological inheritance? These questions created an opening for a man who would become the most destructive figure in the history of Soviet science. Trofim Lysenko. Lysenko was born in 1898 to a peasant family in Ukraine. Unlike Vavilov, who came from a prosperous merchant family and received a first-rate education, Lysenko's background was humble and his scientific training was mediocre at best. He never completed a formal doctorate and had little understanding of mathematics or experimental design. But he possessed something more valuable in Stalin's Soviet Union: the right class background and an instinctive understanding of how to manipulate the political system. In the late 1920s, while working at an agricultural research station in Azerbaijan, Lysenko claimed to have developed a technique called vernalization, which involved treating seeds with cold and moisture before planting to accelerate their development and increase yields. The technique itself was not new and had been known to farmers for generations, but Lysenko presented it as a revolutionary discovery and made extravagant claims about its potential to transform Soviet agriculture. The Soviet press, always eager for stories about worker scientists making breakthroughs that would demonstrate the superiority of socialism, seized upon Lysenko's claims. Here was a man of peasant origin, uncorrupted by bourgeois education, who was using practical wisdom to solve the urgent problems facing Soviet agriculture. The fact that his results could not be reliably replicated by other scientists was dismissed as evidence of their own incompetence, or, more sinisterly, as sabotage by class enemies. Lysenko's rise coincided with a period of increasing political paranoia in the Soviet Union. Stalin had consolidated his power by the early 1930s and was launching wave after wave of purges against perceived enemies. Scientists, like all Soviet citizens, were vulnerable to accusations of wrecking, espionage, or ideological deviation. Lysenko quickly grasped that he could advance his career not through rigorous science, but through political maneuvering, and by positioning himself as the defender of a specifically Soviet biology against the corrupting influence of Western bourgeois science. He began attacking Mendelian genetics as idealistic, metaphysical, and reactionary. According to Lysenko, genes were a fiction invented by capitalist scientists to justify inequality and class oppression. In their place, he proposed a revived form of Lamarckism, which he called Michurinism, after the Russian horticulturalist Ivan Michurin. Lysenko claimed that organisms could be fundamentally transformed through changes in their environment, and that these transformations would be inherited by their offspring. Wheat could be converted into rye, pine trees into fir trees, and cuckoos into warblers, simply by altering the conditions in which they grew. These claims, which violated everything that was known about heredity and evolution, were presented not as hypotheses to be tested, but as established facts that demonstrated the correctness of dialectical materialism. The appeal of Lysenko's ideas to Stalin and other Soviet leaders is not difficult to understand. Lysenkoism offered a biological theory that seemed to align perfectly with Marxist ideology and the goals of the Soviet state. If organisms could be rapidly transformed through environmental manipulation, then the same must be true of human beings. The new Soviet man was not merely a propaganda slogan, but a biological possibility. Moreover, Lysenko promised quick fixes to the agricultural problems that plagued the Soviet Union. His techniques, he claimed, could dramatically increase crop yields without requiring the time-consuming work of breeding new varieties through conventional genetic methods. In a country that had experienced devastating famines, most recently the Ukrainian Holodomor of 1932 to 1933, which killed millions, such promises were seductive. Through the 1930s, Lysenko's influence grew. He became director of the Institute of Genetics of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR and used his position to promote his followers and persecute his opponents. Scientists who defended Mendelian genetics found themselves accused of being enemies of the people, bourgeois idealists, or agents of foreign powers. Many were dismissed from their positions. Some were arrested, and a significant number were executed or died in labor camps. The campaign against genetics was part of the broader Great Terror of 1936 to 1938, during which Stalin's security apparatus arrested over 1.5 million people and executed approximately 700,000. Nikolai Vavilov, despite his international reputation and his genuine commitment to Soviet agriculture, could not escape this maelstrom. Throughout the 1930s, he tried to navigate between scientific integrity and political survival, defending genetics while attempting to avoid direct confrontation with Lysenko. But by 1940, his position had become untenable. On August 6, 1940, while on a plant-collecting expedition in Ukraine, Vavilov was arrested by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. He was charged with belonging to a rightist conspiracy, spying for Britain, and sabotaging Soviet agriculture. The charges were absurd, but under interrogation and torture, Vavilov was forced to confess to some of them. In July 1941, he was sentenced to death, though this was later commuted to 20 years' imprisonment. Vavilov was transferred to Saratov prison, where conditions were brutal. The man who had assembled the world's greatest collection of seeds and devoted his life to combating hunger slowly starved to death. He died on January 26, 1943, of malnutrition, his body weighing less than 40 kilograms. The irony was savage. While Vavilov starved in prison, the seed collection he had built in Leningrad was being protected by his colleagues during the siege of Leningrad, one of the most devastating sieges in human history. During the 900-day siege, which lasted from September 1941 to January 1944, over 1 million civilians died, most from starvation. Yet the scientists at the Vavilov Institute chose to starve rather than eat the seeds they were protecting, understanding that these genetic resources represented the future of Soviet agriculture. At least 9 of them died of hunger while surrounded by edible seeds. Meanwhile, the man who had created this collection was dying of the same cause in a prison cell. With Vavilov eliminated and other leading geneticists silenced, imprisoned, or dead, Lysenko's dominance over Soviet biology was complete. His triumph was formalized at a notorious session of the Lenin All-Union Academy of Agricultural Sciences in August 1948. For over a week, Lysenko and his supporters denounced Mendelian genetics as a bourgeois pseudoscience incompatible with dialectical materialism. Scientists who attempted to defend genetics were shouted down and accused of ideological deviation. At the end of the session, Lysenko announced that his report had been approved by the Central Committee of the Communist Party, making it clear that this was not a scientific debate, but a political directive. Those who refused to accept Lysenkoism would be treated as enemies of the state. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Geneticists throughout the Soviet Union were forced to recant their views or face dismissal, imprisonment, or worse. Genetic research was banned, laboratories were closed, and textbooks were rewritten to eliminate any mention of genes or chromosomes. The damage extended beyond the Soviet Union itself. In the Eastern Bloc countries that fell under Soviet domination after World War II, Lysenkoism was imposed as official doctrine. Scientists in Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, and other socialist states were required to abandon genetics and adopt Lysenko's theories. Some resisted and paid the price. Others complied outwardly while trying to preserve their research in secret. China, after the communist victory in 1949, also embraced Lysenkoism, seeing it as part of the Soviet model they were adopting. The consequences in China were particularly severe. During the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1962, Mao Zedong promoted Lysenkoist agricultural techniques as part of his campaign to rapidly modernize Chinese agriculture. Farmers were instructed to plant seeds extremely densely based on Lysenko's claim that plants of the same species would not compete with each other. They were told to plow deeply, sometimes to depths of several meters, disrupting soil structure. These and other pseudoscientific practices, combined with collectivization, poor planning, and adverse weather, contributed to the Great Chinese Famine, which killed tens of millions of people, making it one of the deadliest famines in human history. Back in the Soviet Union, the practical results of Lysenkoism were consistently disappointing. Despite decades of implementing his techniques and billions of rubles in funding, Soviet agriculture remained inefficient and unproductive. The Soviet Union, which had been a major grain exporter before the revolution, became dependent on imports to feed its population. Lysenko's promised transformations of species never materialized under controlled conditions. When other scientists attempted to replicate his experiments, they failed. But Lysenko always had explanations for these failures. The scientists were saboteurs, the conditions were not quite right, or more time was needed. And because he had Stalin's support, and later that of Nikita Khrushchev, who became Soviet leader after Stalin's death in 1953, Lysenko remained untouchable. The absurdity of the situation was evident to many Soviet scientists, but openly challenging Lysenko remained dangerous even after Stalin's death. The physicist Andrei Sakharov, who would later become a prominent dissident and human rights activist, recalled attending a conference in the early 1960s where Lysenko presented his latest claims. Sakharov, emboldened by his status as the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, stood up and asked Lysenko to explain the statistical basis for his conclusions. Lysenko's response was telling. He said that mathematicians and statisticians had confirmed his work, but when Sakharov asked for their names, Lysenko refused to provide them. The audience, composed of some of the Soviet Union's leading scientists, sat in uncomfortable silence, aware that even with Stalin dead, challenging Lysenko could still carry consequences. The turning point came in 1964, when Khrushchev was ousted from power. Leonid Brezhnev, the new Soviet leader, was less personally invested in Lysenko and more willing to listen to scientists who had been quietly documenting the failures of Lysenkoist agriculture. In 1965, a group of prominent Soviet physicists, including Sakharov, signed a letter to the Central Committee criticizing Lysenkoism and calling for the restoration of legitimate genetics research. The letter was remarkable for its bluntness, describing Lysenko's theories as scientifically bankrupt and his methods as fraudulent. Crucially, the letter came from physicists, chemists, and mathematicians. Scientists whose fields had contributed to Soviet military power and who therefore had credibility that biologists, after years of persecution, lacked. The Soviet leadership, facing mounting evidence that Lysenkoist agriculture was failing and concerned about falling further behind the West in biological sciences, finally withdrew its support from Lysenko. He was removed from his position as director of the Institute of Genetics in 1965, and funding for his projects was cut. Genetics, after nearly 3 decades of suppression, was permitted to resume in the Soviet Union. Scientists who had survived the Lysenko era, along with a new generation who had been trained in secret or abroad, began the slow process of rebuilding Soviet genetics. But the damage was profound and lasting. An entire generation of Soviet geneticists had been lost. Those who had been killed in the purges, like Vavilov, could not be replaced. Those who had been forced to abandon genetics and work in other fields had lost decades of research time. The Soviet Union, which had been at the forefront of genetics research in the 1920s, now lagged far behind the West. When James Watson and Francis Crick discovered the double helix structure of DNA in 1953, launching the molecular biology revolution, Soviet scientists were still forbidden from teaching basic Mendelian genetics. As Western scientists developed new techniques for manipulating genes and understanding their function, Soviet biology remained mired in Lysenkoist pseudoscience. The economic consequences were equally severe. The failure of Soviet agriculture to achieve the productivity levels of Western farming can be attributed to many factors, including collectivization, poor infrastructure, and inefficient planning. But the suppression of genetics played a significant role. Plant breeding, which relies on understanding heredity and selection, is fundamental to improving crop yields. By rejecting genetics and embracing Lysenko's methods, the Soviet Union handicapped its agricultural sector for decades. The Soviet Union's chronic inability to feed its population adequately, its dependence on grain imports from the West, and the long lines for basic food items that characterized Soviet life all had roots in the decisions made in the 1930s and 40s to prioritize ideology over science. The Lysenko affair also had broader implications for Soviet society and for the relationship between science and politics in authoritarian states. It demonstrated that, even in a system that claimed to be based on scientific materialism, political considerations could override empirical evidence. The scientific method, with its emphasis on skepticism, reproducibility, and peer review, proved incompatible with a political system that demanded ideological conformity and punished dissent. Scientists learned that survival required not just competence in their field, but political acumen and willingness to compromise their integrity. This created a culture of cynicism and careerism that extended far beyond biology. Moreover, the Lysenko affair revealed the dangers of allowing political leaders to adjudicate scientific questions. Stalin, Khrushchev, and other Soviet officials lacked the expertise to evaluate Lysenko's claims, but made decisions about scientific truth based on ideological compatibility and political expediency. This pattern would repeat itself in other contexts, from the Soviet Union's initial rejection of cybernetics and quantum mechanics as bourgeois pseudosciences, to the suppression of research that contradicted official narratives about Soviet history or society. The message was clear. Truth was whatever the party said it was, and reality had to conform to ideology, not the other way around. When examining why the Soviet system proved so vulnerable to pseudoscience like Lysenkoism, several factors stand out. The Marxist-Leninist framework, while materialist in its rejection of supernatural explanations, was also dogmatic in its insistence that dialectical materialism provided the correct method for understanding all phenomena, natural and social. This created pressure to make scientific findings conform to Marxist categories and conclusions. The Soviet Union's international isolation, particularly during the Stalin era, meant that Soviet scientists had limited contact with their Western counterparts and could not easily verify or challenge dubious claims by reference to international scientific consensus. The centralization of power in the Soviet system meant that once a pseudoscientific theory gained official backing, there were few mechanisms for correction. And the climate of fear created by the purges meant that even scientists who knew Lysenko was wrong were often too frightened to speak out. It is worth noting that the Soviet Union was not unique in allowing politics to distort science. Nazi Germany's rejection of Jewish physics, including relativity and quantum mechanics, crippled German science and contributed to the failure of the Nazi atomic bomb program. In the United States, the eugenics movement in the early 20th century used pseudo-scientific claims about heredity to justify racist policies, including forced sterilization. More recently, political interference in climate science and public health has demonstrated that the problem of ideology overriding evidence persists. But the Soviet case remains particularly striking because of its scale, duration, and consequences. The rehabilitation of genetics in the Soviet Union after 1965 was slow and incomplete. Lysenko himself lived until 1976, dying at age 78, never having acknowledged the falsity of his theories or expressed remorse for the destruction he had caused. Some of his followers remained in positions of influence, and Lysenkoist ideas continued to appear in Soviet agricultural publications into the 1980s. Nikolai Vavilov was posthumously rehabilitated in 1955, and the Institute of Plant Industry was renamed in his honor. But this could not undo the tragedy of his death or restore the years of research that had been lost. The seed collection he had assembled survived and remains today one of the world's most important repositories of plant genetic diversity, a living monument to his vision and sacrifice. The lessons of the Lysenko affair extend beyond the history of Soviet science. They remind us that scientific progress depends on intellectual freedom, that empirical evidence must take precedence over ideological preference, and that the suppression of dissent, even when justified by appeals to political correctness or social utility, ultimately leads to stagnation and disaster. The story of how the Soviet Union tried to deny Darwinism and genetics is not just a historical curiosity, but a warning about the fragility of scientific institutions and the eternal temptation to subordinate truth to power. In an era when scientific findings on topics ranging from vaccines to climate change are increasingly politicized, when expertise is dismissed as elitism and evidence is treated as just another opinion, the ghost of Trofim Lysenko haunts us still, a reminder of what we stand to lose when we allow ideology to trump reality.